You ever realize you've been invisible to someone for so long that even when they finally look at you, they're just seeing what they're about to lose? I spent 14 years making myself essential to a man who spent 200 years convinced I didn't exist. I knew the exact temperature he wanted his coffee. Knew he listened to Chopin on the nights he missed people who'd been dead for centuries. Knew the way his shoulders dropped when another search for the one came up empty, and how he'd sit by the fireplace like loneliness was something he could read by candlelight if he just tried hard enough. I knew everything about Scott McDowell except how to make him see me as anything other than the woman who kept his immortal life running smoothly. If you've ever loved someone who treated your presence like scenery, you already know where this breaks. There aren't many places that understand what it costs to be essential and invisible at the same time. But they're easy to lose if you're not careful. I came to work for Scott McDowell on a Tuesday in March, 14 years ago. I remember because it was the first warm day after a brutal Boston winter, and I'd walked from the subway to Beacon Hill with my coat open for the first time in months. The brownstone sat on a quiet street where old money whispered instead of shouted, the kind of address that didn't need to announce its importance because everyone who mattered already knew. I was 39 then. Competent. Quiet. The kind of efficient that makes people relax because they know things will simply get done. I'd spent 2 decades managing estates for Boston's wealthy, invisible in the way good staff are supposed to be. I thought this would be another position like all the others. Manage the household, keep things running, collect a paycheck, go home. I had no idea I was about to spend the next 14 years learning the difference between being necessary and being seen. Scott interviewed me in his library, floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves filled with books and languages I didn't recognize, leather chairs worn soft by centuries of use. He was younger than I expected. Or older. It was hard to tell with him. Beautiful in that way that makes you aware of your own mortality, like he'd been carved from something more permanent than flesh. I need someone who understands discretion, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to choose his words carefully over a very long time. My life is unconventional. I keep unusual hours. I have needs that might seem strange to someone who hasn't worked in this particular world.
He meant vampire.
He didn't say it, but I'd done my research. When you manage estates in Boston long enough, you learn which families have been here since before the Revolution, and which families have been here since before the Revolution mattered. The McDowell name appeared in city records going back to 1780. Always the same first name. Always the same face in portraits spaced decades apart. I should have run. Should have politely declined and found work with someone whose biggest secret was tax evasion. Instead, I said, I understand discretion, Mr. McDowell. Scott, he corrected, and something in the way he said it, tired, almost hopeful, made me want to make this strange, lonely man's life easier. That was my first mistake. The first 3 years were simple. Professional. I managed his household with the same efficiency I'd brought to every other position. Made sure his coffee was ready at midnight when he woke. Coordinated with his staff, a rotating cast of people who never lasted more than a year because they couldn't handle the nocturnal schedule or the weight of knowing what he was. Kept his world running so smoothly, he barely had to think about the logistics of immortality. I learned his rhythms. He read by the fireplace on Monday nights. Listened to Chopin when he was grieving someone from his past. Took his coffee black, almost scalding, strong enough to taste like bitterness and memory. He'd sit at his desk going through correspondence that dated back decades, managing investments and properties, and the careful architecture of a life lived in shadows. I learned when to speak and when to simply exist in the same room, a quiet presence that asked for nothing. The moment I fell in love with him happened in year 3, on a November night that smelled like early snow. I'd come into the library to ask about the holiday schedule and found him standing at the window, looking out at the city with an expression I'd never seen before.
Raw.
Unguarded. Completely destroyed. Scott, I said softly. He didn't turn. I got word today that Thomas died. Natural causes. He was 96. I knew Thomas from correspondence, a childhood friend from Scott's human life, one of the last connections to who he'd been before vampirism took him. They'd exchanged letters for decades, carefully maintaining a friendship across the chasm of immortality. "I'm so sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not," Scott said quietly. He got to grow old, had a wife, children, grandchildren, got to be human all the way through. He finally looked at me, and his eyes held 2 centuries of accumulated loss. "Do you know what it's like, Claire? Watching everyone you've ever cared about age and die while you stay exactly the same? I've outlived everyone I've ever loved, everyone who's ever mattered, and I'll keep doing it forever." I should have left him alone with his grief. Should have maintained professional distance. Instead, I stayed. Made him coffee even though he didn't ask for it. Sat in the chair across from his desk while he told me about Thomas, about growing up in Boston when it was still small enough to know everyone, about the revolution they'd lived through together, about the night Scott was turned and had to disappear from Thomas's life for decades before returning as a distant cousin. "I spent the last 60 years watching him fade," Scott said. "And I couldn't even go to his funeral. Because I haven't aged a day since 1824, and that kind of thing tends to raise questions." I fell in love with him in that moment. Not because he was beautiful or powerful or immortal, but because underneath all that eternity, he was just unbearably lonely. And I understood loneliness in a way I'd never admitted to anyone, including myself. From that night on, I wasn't just managing his household. I was building small rituals of comfort into his immortal routine, making sure Chopin was ready on the nights I knew he'd need it, leaving books I thought he'd enjoy on his desk, learning to read his silences, and knowing when he needed company versus solitude. I became essential. Not just useful, essential. The person who knew him well enough to anticipate needs he didn't know he had. I told myself it was just excellent service. That this was what I'd always done, made myself indispensable to the people I worked for. But by year 7, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I loved him.
Completely.
Quietly. In the way you love someone you know will never love you back. And Scott? He kept searching. Every few months, he'd travel to vampire gatherings in other cities. Montreal, San Francisco, New Orleans. Searching for her, his fated mate, the legendary soul match that vampire lore promised every immortal. The one person who would make eternity feel like choice instead of sentence. I'd watch him leave, hope lighting his face in ways I never could. And I'd watch him return weeks later, disappointed again. Another city, another gathering, another woman who seemed promising but ultimately felt wrong. "I don't understand," he said to me once after returning from Prague empty-handed. "I've met hundreds of remarkable women. Beautiful, intelligent, powerful, but none of them feel like home." I was standing 3 feet away, pouring his coffee, and he was looking straight through me. "Maybe you're looking in the wrong places," I said softly. He smiled that tired, sad smile. "Maybe she doesn't exist. Maybe I've been chasing a myth for 200 years. Maybe," I said, and I set his coffee down exactly the way he liked it, and I went back to my office and cried for 20 minutes before returning to manage the rest of his immortal life. By year 11, I'd accepted it. This was my life, loving a man who would never see me as anything other than excellent staff. And I'd made peace with it, in the way you make peace with chronic pain. It doesn't go away. You just learn to live around it. Then Scott met Isabelle. He'd gone to Montreal for a summit, vampire territorial negotiations, something political and tedious that usually left him more exhausted than energized. He was supposed to be gone for 3 days. He stayed for 3 weeks. When he finally came home, he was different. Lighter. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, not hope, exactly. More like relief. Like someone who'd been holding his breath for 2 centuries had finally remembered how to breathe. "Claire," he said, finding me in the kitchen going through the next month's schedule. "I need to talk to you about something." My heart knew before my brain caught up. I set down my tablet very carefully. "I met someone," he said, and the way he said it, reverent, odd, certain, told me everything I needed to know. "Her name is Isabelle. She's from Montreal."
She's...
"Claire, I think she might be the one." I smiled. I actually smiled, because after 14 years of loving him, I'd learned how to perform normalcy even when everything inside me was breaking. That's wonderful, Scott. Tell me about her.
So he did.
And I listened. And I died a little more with every word. Isabelle was 417 years old. Born in Paris during the reign of Louis XIV. Turned during the French Revolution, literally, Scott said with that wondering smile, during the Revolution. She'd watched the Bastille fall. Had fled to Montreal with other aristocratic vampires when the terror made even immortality feel fragile. She spoke 6 languages fluently. Had a collection of first-edition Voltaire that made Scott's library look pedestrian. Understood vampire politics in a way that came from centuries of navigating them.
She was elegant, he said.
Ancient. Intellectually matched in ways he'd never experienced. She gets it, Claire, he said, and his voice carried something I never heard before, not excitement exactly. More like recognition. Like he'd been speaking a language alone for 200 years and finally found someone who spoke it back. She understands what it means to have lived through history, to have lost everyone, to carry centuries of memory that no one else remembers. When I talk to her, I don't have to explain. She already knows. I kept my hand steady on my coffee cup, kept my face arranged in appropriate interest, kept my voice warm when I said, "She sounds perfect for you." "She is," he said simply. "I think she actually is." And that's when I knew. After 11 years of watching him search, I'd learned to recognize the difference between interest and certainty. This wasn't another hopeful maybe that would fade after a few weeks. This was the answer he'd spent 2 centuries looking for. He went back to Montreal the following weekend. And the weekend after that. And then he was gone for a full week, returning only to pack more clothes and handle urgent business before leaving again. His entire life reoriented around her, gravity shifting to a new center that wasn't here, wasn't Boston, wasn't anything I'd spent 14 years carefully building around him. I managed his absence the way I'd managed everything else, efficiently, invisibly, making sure his world kept running smoothly even when he wasn't in it. I coordinated with his business associates, handled his correspondence, made sure his household maintained its rhythms even as the heart of it was beating somewhere else. At night, I'd lie awake in my quarters, the small apartment on the estate's 3rd floor that had been home for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to live anywhere else, and I'd count the ways I'd been a fool. 14 years of convincing myself that being necessary was enough. That intimacy could exist in knowing how he took his coffee and when he needed silence. That love could survive on the crumbs of attention he offered between his endless searches for something more. Someone more. 3 months after Montreal, Scott called a household meeting. We all gathered in the library, the small staff that kept his life running. Me, his part-time chef, the night security, the groundskeeper who maintained the property's careful anonymity. 8 people who knew what he was and had learned to navigate life in the margins of immortality. Scott stood by the fireplace, and the light made him look like something painted in gold and shadow. Beautiful. Unreachable. Exactly what he'd always been. "I wanted to tell you all together," he said, and there was something in his voice, joy, real joy, that made my chest feel like it was caving in on itself. "Isabelle and I are engaged. The wedding will be in October, here at the estate. It'll be a significant event. Vampire nobility from across North America, so we'll need to coordinate carefully. Claire, I'll need your help managing the logistics." The others congratulated him. Someone asked about Isabelle. Would she be moving to Boston? Scott smiled and said yes, she'd be relocating after the wedding. They discussed it at length. She was leaving her own court behind to build a life with him here. I heard myself say appropriate things. Felt my face arrange itself into appropriate expressions. Watched my hands remain steady even though everything inside me was screaming. He was getting married. To someone who'd known him for 3 months. Someone who understood him in ways I never could because she was immortal and ancient and everything I was never going to be. 14 years. And I mattered so little that he assigned me the task of organizing his wedding to someone else. The meeting dissolved. People went back to their duties. Scott was on the phone immediately, calling someone about the engagement announcement, his voice bright with a happiness I'd spent 14 years trying to create and never once managed. I walked back to my quarters on legs that didn't quite feel like mine. Closed the door. Stood in the center of my small living room, the space I'd furnished with books and soft light and all the quiet comfort I couldn't offer anyone else, and I felt something inside me finally, quietly, completely break. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't do anything dramatic. I just stood there and realized with brutal clarity that I'd spent 14 years building my entire existence around a man who was about to build his eternity with someone else. That I'd confused devotion with love, service with partnership, being essential with being seen. That I'd loved him so completely I'd forgotten to live my own life. The decision came not in a flash of anger, but in a slow, cold wave of understanding. I couldn't do this. Couldn't stay and watch him marry her. Couldn't organize flower arrangements and menu tastings and all the careful logistics of his happiness with someone who wasn't me. Couldn't train my replacement and hand over 14 years of accumulated knowledge about how to make his immortal life comfortable. I couldn't be here anymore. At 4 a.m., I sat down at my small desk and wrote my resignation letter. My hands were steady. My thoughts were clear. I'd spent decades being professional, and I was going to leave the same way. Dear Scott, I wrote, I'm writing to give you my notice. After 14 years, I've decided it's time for me to build my own life outside of this position. I'll be happy to stay through the transition period to help train my replacement, but I'll need to leave by the end of October at the latest. I didn't mention love, didn't mention heartbreak, didn't mention that I was bleeding out from a wound he didn't know he'd inflicted. I just stated the facts with the same efficiency I'd brought to everything else. When the sun rose, I printed the letter, walked downstairs while the house was still quiet, left it on his desk where he'd find it when he woke at sunset. Then I went back to my quarters, got dressed for the day, and started doing what I'd always done, managing his life with perfect competence while mine fell apart in places he would never think to look. Scott found my letter that evening. I was in the kitchen going over catering quotes when he appeared in the doorway, the single page in his hand looking impossibly small against everything it was trying to say. Claire, he said, and his voice carried surprise but not devastation. Concern but not comprehension. Your resignation. Can we talk about this? I set down my pen, arranged my face into professional neutrality. Of course. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared 1,000 midnight conversations about nothing important, where I'd listened to him talk about loneliness while being too afraid to admit I understood it from the inside. Why? He asked simply. Did something happen? If it's about salary or responsibilities, we can discuss adjustments. You've been invaluable here, Claire. I don't want to lose you. Invaluable. Not irreplaceable. Not essential in any way that mattered. It's not about the job, I said, and my voice stayed steady because I'd had 14 years to practice keeping my heart out of my words. I've been here a long time. I think it's time I built something of my own. Something that's mine. He looked genuinely confused. But you have built something here. This household runs because of you. I rely on you for, he gestured vaguely, everything. I know, I said quietly, and that's why I need to leave. He didn't understand. I could see it in his face, that blank incomprehension of someone who'd never considered that being relied upon wasn't the same as being chosen. That being necessary wasn't the same as being seen. Well, he said finally, if you're certain. But Claire, I need you through the transition. The wedding is in 6 months, October 15th. It's going to be complicated, vampire nobility from across the continent, political implications I can't even begin to explain. I need someone who knows how this household works, who understands the nuances. Would you be willing to stay until then? Help me find and train your replacement. I should have said no. Should have left immediately, salvaged what was left of my dignity, saved myself from what was coming. Instead, I heard myself say, yes, I can do that. His relief was immediate, genuine. Thank you, Claire. Really. I don't know what I'd do without you. He left the kitchen, already pulling out his phone to call Isabelle, to tell her that everything was handled, that Claire had agreed to stay, that the wedding would go smoothly, because Claire always made things go smoothly. I sat there alone at the kitchen table and tried to understand what had just happened. Why I'd agreed to this. Was it duty? Was it some masochistic need to see this through to its bitter end? Was it spite? The desire to show him exactly what he was losing by being too blind to see it until I was already gone? Maybe it was all three. Maybe after 14 years of loving someone who didn't love you back, you stopped being able to distinguish between devotion and self-destruction. The next week, I interviewed my replacement. Her name was Bryn, 29, bright-eyed, enthusiastically competent in that way young professionals are when they think efficiency is the same as wisdom. She'd worked for 2 other vampire households, had excellent references, asked intelligent questions about Scott's preferences and the estate's routines. She didn't love him. That was the first thing I noticed. The relief of it almost made me laugh. She was respectful, professional, genuinely excited about the opportunity. But when Scott walked through during her interview, she didn't track him with her eyes the way I'd spent 11 years trying not to. She didn't catalog the small changes in his mood or wonder what he was thinking. She just took notes and asked about the filing system. She seems perfect, Scott said after Bryn left. You'll train her? Yes, I said, and I started teaching someone else how to know him, how to make his coffee, when to leave him alone, what silence meant. I handed over 14 years of accumulated intimacy piece by careful piece, watching Bryn absorb it all with cheerful efficiency and none of the weight. She'd be better at this job than I was, because she'd do it without bleeding. The wedding planning consumed everything. Isabelle came to Boston more frequently, first for weekends, then for entire weeks. She was exactly as Scott had described: elegant, sophisticated, impossibly self-possessed. She had this way of moving through the estate like she already owned it, making decisions about renovations and redecorating with the confidence of someone who knew she'd be here forever. She was kind to me in that distant, courteous way aristocrats are kind to staff. She remembered my name, thanked me for my work, never once seemed to notice that I was dying a little more every day. I watched Scott with her. Watched the way he looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for 2 centuries. Watched him include her in his court business, introduce her to his associates, discuss politics and territory and all the immortal complications I'd never been allowed to understand. Watched him see her in ways he'd never seen me. That was the worst part. Not that he loved her, but that he was clearly capable of seeing someone, of including them, of making them part of his world. He just wasn't capable of seeing me. I organized flower arrangements, chose between orchids and roses, coordinated with caterers about menus that would satisfy vampire palates, hired musicians, managed the guest list, vampire nobility whose names appeared in history books, arriving to witness Scott's eternal happiness with someone who wasn't human, wasn't temporary, wasn't me. Every decision was a small death. Every choice, ivory or champagne linens, string quartet or chamber orchestra, another way of building the architecture of my own irrelevance. 3 months in, I found myself alone in the ballroom at 2 a.m., standing in the space where Scott would marry Isabelle in 12 weeks. The room was beautiful, even empty, tall windows overlooking the gardens, crown molding that dated back to when the house was built, hardwood floors that had witnessed 2 centuries of vampire gatherings. This was where it would happen, where he'd promise her eternity, where I'd stand in the back in my professional capacity, having organized every detail of the ceremony that would seal my insignificance. I thought about all the ways I'd made myself essential to his life, all the small intimacies I'd mistaken for connection, all the years I'd spent believing that being necessary would eventually translate into being seen. And I realized he was capable of seeing someone. He saw Isabelle. He included her, consulted her, built his future around her. He just didn't see me, not because he couldn't, but because I was human, temporary staff. Because I poured his coffee and managed his schedule and existed so seamlessly in his life that I'd become part of the infrastructure. Necessary, but invisible. Essential, but not quite real. I stood there in that empty ballroom and understood with brutal clarity that this was what the next 12 weeks would feel like. Watching someone be chosen while I organized the details of my own erasure. But I'd made a promise. And after 14 years of keeping Scott's life running smoothly, I was going to keep this one too.
Even if it killed me.
Even if I had to hold myself together with spite and duty and the grim satisfaction of knowing that someday, when I was long gone, he'd remember the woman who poured his coffee and wonder why she left. 3 weeks before the wedding, I stopped being able to hold it together. It happened at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been working late on final vendor confirmations. The florist needed approval on the ceremony arch design. The caterer had questions about the timing for the midnight toast. Small details that mattered intensely to everyone except me. I'd answered every email with my usual efficiency, made every decision with the same careful attention I'd brought to 14 years of managing Scott's life. Then I closed my laptop and something inside me just broke. I went down to the garden because I didn't want anyone to hear me. The estate's gardens were Scott's pride, carefully maintained English roses and stone pathways, the kind of cultivated wilderness that took centuries of patience to perfect. There was a bench hidden behind the hedges where I used to sit sometimes when the house felt too full of him, and I needed to remember how to breathe. I sat there in the dark, and I cried. Not the quiet, contained tears I'd allowed myself before. This was something bigger, uglier, more honest. The kind of crying that sounds like drowning. 14 years of swallowed grief finally forcing its way out. I cried for the woman I'd been at 39, walking into that brownstone thinking this was just another job. I cried for every small moment of intimacy I'd mistaken for connection, every midnight conversation, every shared silence, every time he'd smiled at something I said and I'd felt my heart break a little more. I cried for 11 years of loving someone who treated my presence like background music.
Pretty.
Convenient. Easy to ignore. I cried because in 3 weeks I'd stand in the back of that ballroom and watch him promise forever to someone he'd known for 9 months, while I'd spent 14 years learning the architecture of his loneliness and never once mattering enough for him to learn mine. I didn't hear him approach. Didn't realize he was there until his voice cut through the sound of my own breaking. Claire? I looked up and there he was, standing at the edge of the pathway in the moonlight, looking at me with genuine concern. Like he'd stumbled across a stranger in distress instead of the woman who'd organized every detail of his existence for 14 years. "What's wrong?" he asked, and he actually sounded worried. "Are you hurt? Did something happen?" I should have lied. Should have pulled myself together, said I was fine, maintained the professional distance I'd perfected over a decade and a half. Instead, something inside me that had been holding for too long just let go. "Yes," I said, and my voice came out raw and broken. "Something happened. 14 years ago. I started working for you. And 3 years after that, I fell in love with you. And I've spent the last 11 years watching you search the entire world for someone to love, while I stood right in front of you pouring your coffee and pretending my heart wasn't shattering every single time you came home disappointed from another city, another search, another woman who wasn't quite right." Scott went very still. That particular vampire stillness that's different from human quiet, like he'd stopped existing in time altogether. "Claire, I know you take your coffee black at midnight," I continued, and now that I'd started, I couldn't stop. 14 years of silence was coming out all at once. "I know you listen to Chopin when you're grieving people who've been dead for 200 years. I know the exact way your shoulders drop when another search comes up empty. I know you read by the fireplace on Monday nights. I know you can't sleep after difficult court negotiations. I know everything about you, Scott. I know you better than anyone alive. And you've never once, not once in 14 years, looked at me like I was anything other than furniture. That's not." His voice sounded strangled. "I never thought of you as. What did you think of me as?" The question came out quiet. "Devastating. Your household manager? Your employee? The woman who keeps your immortal life running smoothly so you don't have to think about the logistics? Did you ever think of me at all when I wasn't standing in front of you asking about your schedule?" He didn't answer.
Couldn't answer.
Because we both knew the truth. Why didn't you ever say anything? He finally asked, and there was something almost like pain in his voice. Claire, if you felt this way, why didn't you tell me? I laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. Because you weren't looking for me, Scott. You were looking for a queen. Someone immortal and powerful and ancient who could understand centuries of existence. Someone who could stand beside you in court politics and vampire gatherings and all the things that matter in your world. And I was just the woman who poured your coffee. You're not just. Yes, I am. I stood up, and I was surprised to find my legs still worked. I've spent 14 years being exactly that. Being so essential to your daily existence that you forgot I was a person with feelings and needs and a heart that's been breaking for 11 years. You found Isabelle in 3 months. 3 months, Scott. And you're marrying her. You're giving her everything I've spent over a decade, hoping you'd someday see in me. I didn't know, he said, and he sounded genuinely devastated. Claire, I didn't know you felt. I know you didn't. That's the problem. I wiped my face with hands that were still shaking. I've been invisible to you for so long that even when I'm falling apart, you're surprised. Even now, standing here telling you I love you, I can see you trying to reconcile this information with the person you thought I was. The efficient household manager who never asks for anything, who never needs anything, who just exists to make your life easier. That's not fair. None of this is fair. My voice broke on the words. It's not fair that I love you. It's not fair that you found someone perfect in 3 months. It's not fair that I've spent 14 years learning how to be invisible because that's what you needed from me. And it's definitely not fair that I agreed to stay and organize your wedding to someone else because I'm so well trained in putting your needs above mine that I couldn't even save myself when it mattered. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, the kind that changes things irrevocably. Claire, Scott said finally, and his voice carried something I'd never heard before. Something like horror. I never wanted to hurt you. I know, I said softly. That's what makes it worse. You didn't even notice me enough to hurt me on purpose. I just disappeared, right in front of you, and you never saw it happening. I walked past him back toward the house, and for the first time in 14 years, I didn't ask if he needed anything. Didn't check if his schedule for tomorrow was confirmed. Didn't do any of the small invisible labor that had defined our entire relationship. I just left him standing alone in the garden, finally seeing me. 3 weeks too late. I didn't see Scott for 2 days after the garden. I moved through the estate like a ghost, finishing final wedding preparations with mechanical efficiency while carefully avoiding any room he might be in. Bryn handled most of the direct communication, shuttling messages between us like we were diplomats from warring countries. On the 3rd day, the household phone started ringing. Isabelle first, her voice tight with confusion. Then members of Scott's court, vampires whose names I'd seen in correspondence for years, suddenly calling the estate line demanding to speak with him. By noon, the phone was ringing every 15 minutes. Bryn found me in the office around 2 p.m., her eyes wide. Claire, something's happening. Isabelle just called again. She says Scott won't answer her calls. She says She paused, lowering her voice like she was afraid to say it out loud. She says he called off the wedding. The world tilted. Just slightly. Just enough to make me grip the edge of my desk. When? Last night. He called her at 3 a.m. Told her he couldn't marry her. Wouldn't explain why. She's on her way here now and she sounds, Bryn swallowed, really angry. I should have felt vindicated. Should have felt some savage satisfaction that he'd finally seen what he was losing. Instead, I just felt tired. So tired I could barely remember what it felt like to not be exhausted by loving someone who didn't love me back. Handle it, I told Bryn. You're the household manager now. This is your job. But Claire, I'll be in my quarters. I'm not part of this anymore. I made it upstairs before Scott found me. He was waiting outside my door, and when I saw him, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked, destroyed was the only word for it. Like someone had taken apart something fundamental and couldn't figure out how to put it back together. Claire, he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. Please. I need to talk to you. There's nothing to talk about. I moved to unlock my door. You called off your wedding. That's between you and Isabelle. It's not about Isabelle. He caught my arm, gentle but desperate. It's about you. It's always been about you, and I was too blind to see it. I pulled away from his touch. Don't. You were right. About everything.
His voice was raw.
I spent 200 years searching for something I already had. The person who knows me better than anyone. Who makes eternity bearable just by existing in the same space. Who understands my loneliness because she's been carrying her own right next to mine for 11 years. Scott. You're my soul match, Claire.
You.
Not Isabelle. Not any of the hundreds of women I've met over 2 centuries.
You.
The woman who's been standing in front of me for 14 years while I looked everywhere else. The words should have meant everything. 6 months ago, 3 weeks ago, hearing him say this would have fixed every broken piece inside me. Now they just hurt. You only see me now because you're losing me, I said quietly. That's not love, Scott. That's panic. It's not. He ran his hands through his hair, that gesture I'd watched 1,000 times. I know how this looks. I know the timing is. But Claire, I spent the last 2 days going through every memory I have of you. Every conversation. Every moment. And I finally saw what you've been trying to show me all along. You're not just essential. You're everything. You had 14 years to notice that. My voice stayed steady, even though everything inside me wanted to scream. 14 years to look at me and see a person instead of infrastructure. But you didn't. You saw me the exact second I told you I was leaving. When I finally stopped being available. When you realized you were about to lose something you'd taken for granted for over a decade. That's not fair. None of this is fair. I finally looked at him directly, and I watched him flinch at whatever he saw in my face. Do you know what it's been like? Watching you search the world for your perfect queen while I stood right here loving you so completely, I forgot how to live my own life. Do you know how many times I made myself smaller so I wouldn't be too much? How many times I swallowed what I needed so you could have what you wanted? I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this. I felt something inside me break cleanly. Finally. You're offering me everything now because you're terrified of being alone again. Because you finally realized what you had after it was already gone. But Scott, I don't want to be loved because I'm leaving. I want to be loved because I stayed. You can stay. He stepped closer, and there was something like desperation in his eyes. Claire, stay. Let me turn you. Let me give you immortality. Let me spend eternity making up for being too blind to see you. I'll give you everything I promised Isabelle. Marriage, partnership, a place in my court. You'll never be invisible again. The offer hung between us like something poisonous and sweet. No, I said simply. He looked like I'd struck him. No. I don't want to spend eternity with someone who only figured out I mattered when I gave my notice. I kept my voice gentle because this wasn't about cruelty. This was about truth. You're capable of seeing someone, Scott. You proved that with Isabelle. You saw her immediately, included her, built a future around her in 3 months. You just weren't capable of seeing me. Not until I was about to disappear. And I refuse to spend forever wondering if you only love me because I'm the one who got away. Claire, please. I spent 14 years making myself essential to your existence. I'm not spending eternity doing the same thing. I unlocked my door and stepped inside. I'm leaving Boston this week. Bryn can handle the wedding cancellation logistics. She's good at her job. Better than I was because she doesn't love you. Where will you go? Somewhere you won't find me. I looked at him one last time. This beautiful, broken, immortal man who'd spent 2 centuries searching for something that had been pouring his coffee the whole time. Goodbye, Scott. This can't be goodbye. Claire, I love you. I know you do. And that was the cruelest part. I could hear the truth in his voice. See it in his eyes. Feel it in the way he was looking at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. But you love me now because you're losing me. And I've spent too many years being loved conditionally to accept love that only exists in my absence. I closed the door between us. Locked it. Stood there listening to him breathe on the other side. That unnecessary breath vampires take when they're feeling human emotions they can't quite process. "Claire," he said through the door, his voice wrecked. "Please." But I didn't answer. Didn't open the door. Didn't give him another chance to convince me that this time would be different. Because I'd finally learned that being someone's everything after you leave is not the same as being someone's choice when you stay. And I'd spent 14 years being chosen last. I wasn't doing it for eternity. I left Boston on a Thursday morning in late October, the day Scott's wedding should have happened. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Just packed my life into 2 suitcases and a rental car and drove until Boston was small enough in my rearview mirror to pretend it had never existed. Vancouver found me by accident. I'd stopped there thinking it would be temporary, just another city to catch my breath in before moving on. But something about the rain and the ocean and the way the mountains stood against the sky made me want to stay. Made me want to remember what it felt like to build a life that belonged only to me. I found work at a small nonprofit managing operations for housing initiatives. The pay was modest, the hours reasonable, the work meaningful in quiet ways that didn't require bleeding yourself dry. My coworkers became friends. Real friends. The kind who invited me to dinner parties and book clubs and didn't expect me to disappear into the background of their lives. I started dating again at 45. Nothing serious at first. Just remembering what it felt like to be seen by someone from the beginning. To have a man look at me across a dinner table and actually see me. Not staff, not infrastructure, just a woman worth knowing. There was Thomas, a high school English teacher, who took me hiking and introduced me to his sister, and never once made me feel like my presence was something to manage or hide. We dated for 2 years. It ended gently when he got a job opportunity in Toronto, both of us mature enough to know that some love is good and real, and still not quite enough. Then Patricia, yes, Patricia, who taught me that desire doesn't have a gender and that being 47 doesn't mean you're done discovering new things about yourself. We had 6 beautiful months before she moved back to Montreal to care for her aging mother. We still send holiday cards. The years pass the way years do, when you're actually living them instead of just existing in someone else's margins. I turned 48, then 50, then 53. My hair started graying at the temples. Laugh lines appeared around my eyes, actual laugh lines, from actual laughing, from a life that had space for joy. I learned to garden, took a pottery class, spent Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, built a life so ordinary and full that sometimes I'd go entire weeks without thinking about Boston or Scott or the 14 years I'd spent loving someone who couldn't see me. I became someone I recognized when I looked in the mirror. Someone softer around the edges. Someone who'd survived her own ending and built something new from what was left. Then, exactly 10 years after I'd left Boston, Scott appeared on my doorstep. It was early evening in October, the same time of year I'd left, like he'd waited for the anniversary. I opened my door expecting a delivery and found him standing there instead, looking exactly the same as he had a decade ago. Young, beautiful, untouched by time in all the ways I'd been marked by it. "Hello, Claire," he said quietly. I should have been shocked. Should have felt something dramatic, anger or grief or the ghost of that old love rising up like muscle memory. Instead, I just felt sad. Sad for him, mostly. For what he was about to understand. "Scott," I said, and my voice was gentle. Kind even. "You shouldn't be here." "I know. He looked at me, really looked, and I watched him take in the changes. The gray hair. The lines around my eyes. The softness that comes from actually living instead of just serving. "You look beautiful." "I look 53. I leaned against my doorframe, not inviting him in. Which is what happens when you spend a decade actually living your life. "I've been looking for you," he said. "It took me this long to find you. You disappeared so completely." "I know. That was intentional." "Claire, please.
Can we talk?"
Can I just..." His voice broke slightly. "Can I just tell you that you were right? About everything? That I've spent 10 years understanding exactly what I lost? That not a single night has passed when I didn't think about you, about how blind I was, about how I destroyed the only real thing I've ever had. I know, I said softly. And I'm sorry you've been in pain. I really am. But Scott, I can't fix that for you. I spent 14 years trying to fix your loneliness, and it almost destroyed me. I'm not doing it again. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm just asking, he stopped. Start it again. I'm asking if there's any chance, any possibility that you could forgive me, that we could try again, that I could spend whatever time you have left showing you how much you matter. Whatever time I have left, I repeated. You hear that, right? I'm mortal, Scott. I'll be gone in 20, maybe 30 years if I'm lucky. And you'll still be here, still young, still beautiful, still carrying this for eternity. I don't care. But I do. I looked at him. This man I'd loved so completely I'd forgotten how to love myself, and I felt nothing but compassion. I spent 14 years waiting for you to notice me. I'm not spending what's left of my life doing the same thing. I'm noticing you now. I know you are. But Scott, you're seeing me now because I left. Because I became unavailable. Because losing me taught you what you had. And that's a beautiful lesson for you to learn. I hope it changes how you see people. I hope it makes you better. I straightened, preparing to close the door. But I'm not your lesson. I'm not your redemption. I'm just a woman who finally learned to choose herself. Claire, please. I have a good life here, I said gently. I have friends who know my name. I have work that matters. I've loved people who saw me from the beginning. I've laughed more in the last 10 years than I did in all 14 years with you. And I've made peace with the fact that I'm going to age and die, and that's exactly what I want. Because I'd rather have 30 mortal years of being fully alive than an eternity of wondering if I'm only loved because I left. I watched understanding settle into his eyes. The final, brutal comprehension that this wasn't a negotiation. That I wasn't playing hard to get or testing him. That I was simply, genuinely done. I'm sorry, he whispered. For all of it. I'm so sorry. I forgive you, I said, and I meant it. I forgave you years ago. But forgiveness doesn't mean going back. It just means I'm finally free. I started to close the door, then paused. One last thing I needed him to understand. There are other women like me in the city, I said softly. Women who loved immortal things that never learned to love them back until it was too late. We don't talk about it. But we recognize each other in coffee shops, in bookstores, in the way we've learned to build lives that don't revolve around someone else's eternity. These stories don't always find you twice. But if this one did, if you felt the weight of what it means to choose yourself after years of choosing someone else, there are more. Women like you. Moments like this. You just have to make sure you don't lose them. Then I closed the door. Gently. Finally. I didn't watch through the window. Didn't check to see when he left. Just went back to my kitchen where I'd been making dinner, turned the music back on, and continued living the life I'd built. Later, my neighbor told me a man had stood on my porch until sunrise. That he'd looked up at my windows as the sky turned pink, as if memorizing something he'd never properly seen before. That he'd finally disappeared just as the first rays of light threatened to burn him. I thought about him sometimes after that. Hoped he learned his lesson. Hoped he found someone else and saw them from the beginning. Hoped he spent his immortality becoming someone who deserved the love he received instead of only recognizing it in absence. But mostly I just lived. Fully. Completely. In the precious, finite, beautiful time I had left. And when I was 108, my hair fully silver and my face mapped with decades of laughter, I died in my sleep after a life so full it felt like grace. Scott is still out there somewhere. Still young. Still beautiful. Still carrying 200 years of regret and the knowledge that he found his perfect queen 200 years early and lost her by looking everywhere except right in front of him. He'll carry that forever. But I don't carry him anymore. And that was worth everything.